not surprising to anyone. Probably not lost on anyone that the federal government is the largest supporter of research activity at the university. At most universities, federal funding accounts for about 60% of research activity, but the proportion of research overall that is funded by the federal government has been shrinking and decreasing over time. Over time, we've seen more industry-sponsored research, more privately funded research from foundations and nonprofits, more funding from the university itself added to the mix. If we look at KU itself, in 2021, about half of our research was federally funded. And this is looking at expenditures. So it's actually looking at expense and sort of what's spent, not dollars coming in on the front end. But I think it carries the same point. About half of our research is federally funded here at KU. Over time, if we go back to the 70s, the first year they started tracking how much money the federal government was putting into academic research, it was about $1.8 billion. The latest data from I could get, at least, was from 2021, and now it's about $50 billion put forth towards basic and applied research. And that, again, comes from all of those agencies that we are well familiar with. The sad part of the story, or sad parts of the story, right? All sounds good. It's growth, lots of money, is it's been relatively flat for about 10 or 15 years, just barely keeping pace with inflation. Now, in the last couple of years, we have seen a couple bumps. One was through the CARES Act when the pandemic occurred, right? That was additional money put forth to help address some of the unique concerns that came out of the pandemic. And then the CHIPS Act, which is very much focused on semiconductor research and sort of rehoming to the United States that industry. So otherwise, it's been relatively flat. And if we compare ourselves to our colleagues in other countries, we do see that the US, as a percentage of its overall budget, is spending less today on academic research than places like Japan and Korea and Germany. And so while it's great, we're very happy to have the federal government as such a big supporter of the research enterprise. There's always room for growth, and we do need to keep that message going forward to our constituents and our representatives, and such that what we do is important, and more dollars are needed if we want to keep pace. So where does that fit, right? Let's take a little bit of a history lesson, and how does that play into innovation at a university? Well, if we go back and we look prior to World War II, what we see when it comes to research activity is that there was no coordinated federal research system. Most of the research taking place at universities was either funded internally by the university itself or by private donors or private donors. We go forth in time and we hit World War II. Obviously, lots of things happened very quickly as part of the war effort. One of the key pieces that happens is it starts bringing together academia, the federal government, and industry all together to conduct research. Lots of money goes into research. Lots of interesting things are developed and discovered during that period of time. And it results with the creation of the federal research system and the federal lab system. Problem is, every agency has its own policy and every agency is functioning differently. Federal government owns all of the inventions that are made by sponsored research from any of their agencies, and very little is actually making its way for public benefit. Then we go forward a little bit more in time, and we come to the 1970s. What do we see in the 70s? We see a period of economic stagnation here in the US. There is a big concern during the 70s around the US losing its competitive edge to Germany, to Japan. And so policymakers, the federal government, academia all sort of come together and say, we need to address this problem. We need to help support and make the US competitive. Otherwise, we're going to lose that edge. All of those conversations come together with the passage of something called the Bayh-Dole Act. Happens to be my favorite piece of legislation. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in the coming slides. That is primarily focused on unlocking the innovation potential at the universities and the talent at our universities. It's designed to promote the transfer and application of government-sponsored research for the benefit both of the inventors and the general public. That starts in the 80s. Get to the 2000s, what do we see? We see an increased number of inventions reaching the public and an increase in the impact of those inventions. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. What was it like before this Bayh-Dole Act was passed? Again, in details, every invention created using federal funds was owned by the federal government and administered by the individual funding agency. So great. Federal government, not known for being the most efficient in some cases. There was no uniform policy amongst any of those agencies for how to manage IP, transfer inventions, or work with industry partners for further development, right? Each agency had its own policies and practices, and they were entirely inconsistent with one another. So you might imagine if you were an industry partner coming and wanting to work or invest in an invention that had come from federally sponsored research, it's different for every agency that you work with. It's very confusing, it's not consistent, and therefore industry, shies away from working on those types of inventions or investing in developing those inventions further. Similarly, the US government controls every single patent. There is a ban on exclusive licensing, right? So if, again, I'm an industry partner coming, wanting to invest in a great discovery that had come from federally sponsored research, I can't get an exclusive license. I can license it non-exclusively, but that also means that you, federal government, can go and license to one of my competitors. Why and what is the incentive for me, company, then to go and invest my time, effort, and resources in developing a product from there? It's very low. Other problems here before the Bayh-Dole Act, the inventors are separated from their inventions, right? Inventors, you are here, you are part of our university community. The inventions, they're managed by the federal government. There's a disconnect there. And we often know that along with the transfer of IP rights or a patent or an invention, there's a knowledge transfer that has to go with that. That comes in part from our inventors, right? There's additional information, there's know-how, those sort of things that need to be shared. It's very difficult when they're separated from their inventions. So what we see is that even though federal funding is growing throughout this time period, more money is being put into research, the number of inventions being disclosed or recognized continues to shrink. And in fact, by 1978, the US government owns 28,000 patents from research activities, but has licensed less than 4%. It's not a very good throughput, not a very good hit rate. Again, head to the 80s, the Bayh-Dole Act gets passed. This act, again, is the critical piece, and it's what gives the university ownership of inventions that come from federally sponsored research. Was a bipartisan act, named for Birch Bayh, the great senator from Indiana, and Bob Dole, a local son and hero here in Kansas. Really who could work across the aisle. We do have doubts that this kind of legislation could happen today. So thank God that it happened back in the 80s. It does a couple things, does a number of things, I should say. Create the uniform policy for federal intellectual property, right? All of a sudden now, every different agency, regardless of which one is sponsoring your work, operates under the same process, same procedures, and same policy. It is consistent. I can work with NIH, I can work with NSF, I can work with DoD. It's the same experience regardless of which one I am working with. Critically, it enables the university, the nonprofit, or a small business, if that's who the grantee is, to own the inventions and discoveries that are made from those federally sponsored dollars. And like any good deal, we'll talk about this a little more in a couple slides, it includes obligations and requirements on the university if we choose to own those inventions and discoveries. I like to also say that this legislation has been recognized as being one of the maybe most impactful of the last 50 years. In fact, The Economist magazine called it innovation's golden goose, right? It was this sort of great idea that helped unlock the untapped potential for innovation at our institutions. After the Bayh-Dole Act passes, we see a steady increase in academic patenting, licensing, and revenue, lots and lots of industrial output, lots of companies, lots of jobs. Last time it was measured, we see a great deal of public benefit, lots of new products, drugs, vaccines, devices, technologies, all of those sort of things which you might expect. However, the example I like to draw from is if you've eaten a strawberry or had some corn in the last couple of days, it is very likely that that corn variety, that strawberry varietal that you're eating, was developed at a university in part with federal funds. So that is part of this whole, this whole concept that we're talking about. We've also seen since the passage of the act that industry has started to rely more on academia for new ideas, right? We are often the starting point for the creation or the generation of a new idea that can be turned into a product. And that success has led to the Bayh-Dole Act and legislation being emulated elsewhere. So if we look around the world, we see that India, the UK, Germany, Japan, Korea, China, all of these countries have some flavor of this legislation for their own sponsored research at home in their country. Now, that's all great. I also like to recognize that the pendulum has started to swing the other direction in the last few years. And so something to be aware of is that we are starting to see agencies change their approach. We're starting to see agencies use sort of gaps in the legislation or bypasses around the legislation to include additional terms and conditions in their grants and contracts with the university that impact our ability to commercialize inventions. The key one that we've seen lately that is of concern is the Department of Energy. We've seen a lot of activity from them, particularly around requirements around products to be manufactured in the US and where they'll be manufactured in the US, and some of those things much more stringent than what we are used to. So pendulum, again, swinging a little bit the other way, something to keep an eye on. So again, I mentioned earlier, like any good piece of legislation, we're going to give you something. You can own your inventions, university, but we're also going to require something on the back end. What do those requirements look like? So you'll see these again consistently across most federal grants. You'll also find very similar requirements in most contracts. If it's not a grant and it's a contract from a federal agency, oftentimes you'll see the same kind of language. Great thing, we own, creates offices like our office here, but the other side of the coin, we are required to do many things. What are we required to do? The first thing we're required to do is we're required to let the federal government know, or the agency that sponsored know within 2 months of becoming aware that a new invention has been made. So that's a reporting requirement. It's pretty common. And if you've ever done a grant closeout at the end of a grant, you'll see something very similar where there is an obligation to report all of the inventions that were made using the grant dollars. This is sort of the front end of that. We are supposed to report within 2 months of becoming aware. Also, we have to proactively tell the federal government that we want to maintain ownership of that invention and we don't want it to default to the federal government. So we have 2 years to go do that. We go on record and say, hey, federal government, we want to try to do something with this particular invention that's come from research on our campus. And that's how we maintain the title and ownership of that particular invention. We also have to grant a non-exclusive license to the federal government for government use purposes. We have to allow for federal marching rights. We'll talk more about that because I think it's probably something that's of interest to some of the folks in the audience today, what a marching right is and how it's used. Other requirements on us, we have to be diligent in pursuing patent rights and commercialization. So if we choose to own something, we can't just sit it on the shelf and say, oh, it looks pretty and collect dust. We are incentivized to move forward and try to protect it and then find a partner to develop something from that invention. We've got lots of updates, requirements, utilization, these sort of things that happen every year. Have to tell them what patents were filed and where they were filed. Other things that are of interest, particularly to our innovators, we are required to share royalties with the inventors of the IP. So we'll talk more about that at the end of this presentation, but there is a method and a mechanism for sharing some of the revenue with our inventors. And lastly, because these are tax dollars that are sponsoring the research, there is a required preference to license our right to small businesses and US-based businesses. The idea there being, again, we're going to help support the economy of the United States. And again, it's sort of circular, dollars in from federal tax dollars, output and benefit locally to the United States. Most of these obligations are reported via something called iEdison. If you ever work with us, you may hear that come up from time to time. iEdison is our reporting software. And if we don't do any of these things, or we don't do them adequately, there is a chance that we will lose our ownership rights. The federal government can come in and take those rights back. So we are, again, really incentivized to try to do something with the technology and meet the obligations that the federal government has put in front of us. Now, I mentioned margin rights. What are margin rights? Those are a requirement that allows an agency to ignore the exclusivity of our license and give a license to somebody else that is a reasonable applicant. Now, there are limitations on when they can use this right. The four main places where this right can be used are: one, if the grantee, that's us, the university, has not taken or is not expected to take steps to try to achieve a practical application for the invention. Now, that's government speak to say we're not trying to do anything to help it develop into a product or move it forward on its development pathway. The second case is to alleviate a health or safety concern that is not currently satisfied, right? That is one that has come up recently, and that's why I say this provision is of interest. It's come up around some of the mRNA vaccine technology, and whether the government should insert itself with its margin rights to take control and license those rights aside from whoever they are currently licensed to exclusively, Pfizer and such. The third state where they can march in is if there's a requirement specified by federal regulations that's not being reasonably satisfied. And the last one is if the preference for US industry or US licensees has not been obtained. Now, where this really gets interesting, I think here is on this next part, which is, to date, no federal agency has ever exercised its margin rights. So we're like 40 years in and nobody's ever done it. There have been 5 petitions to NIH to do this. Very much in the scope of trying to use these rights to control drug prices or increase competition and access to proprietary drugs. NIH has reviewed all of those petitions and come back and clarified repeatedly that this is not a mechanism that should be used for controlling drug prices or availability. Their point of view is that that should be handled through legislation, not through this provision, which really wasn't built to accommodate that concern. So you'll hear that from time to time. If you look and you see and you research about drug pricing and drug accessibility, you'll see lots of conversations about the government using its margin rights. This is what they mean by those. So that's sort of the end of the basics about Bayh-Dole legislation, how the university ends up owning IP that comes from federal research. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to start talking particularly about what my office does and how you, as an innovator and a creator of a new technology or invention, may move that invention through the university towards commercialization. So I call this the basics. It's a very complicated process. This is a simplified diagram. There are lots of offshoots, not all linear. Some of this is circular. Sometimes we have to step back. And when we get to that sort of commercialization step, they're all the way on the right. Lots of other sub-steps included there. But I think for this purpose, this is the easiest way to think about it. So let's start where we've been talking for the last 15, 20 minutes, which is with research. Lots and lots of good research happening. You, as our researchers, are generating really interesting questions, conducting great studies, finding great results, drawing incredible insights. All of those things are happening. We talked also about the federal government sponsoring half of the research, the other half coming from other places. Well, how does the university end up owning all of the IP, right? This is a common question that comes up from our faculty. Well, we can point back not just to Bayh-Dole, but also to the university's IP policy. And again, I'll talk about KU's policy in particular here, but if you're at one of our partner institutions, those institutions will have a similar policy somewhere for you to be aware of. KU's policy applies to all our full and part-time employees, faculty, staff, and student employees. And it differentiates between copyrighted inventions and patentable inventions. When we talk about copyrighted inventions, what KU does not own under its IP policy are traditional scholarly works and course materials, unless for some reason the university has paid you expressly to make those course materials. So if we're paying you to make a course, we may own the resulting copyrighted works. So again, this is sort of the traditional academic things that are aligned with scholarship and education. KU doesn't insert itself to own those. Where we do own those copyrighted materials, however, are in the cases of software or anything else that has been done using KU resources that are sort of above and beyond what is afforded to all members of the KU community, or if it's resulting from sponsored work. That subset of copyrighted inventions, KU will own. If we talk about patentable inventions, these are your widgets, your drugs, your medical devices, your research reagents that you may have created. KU does own the rights in those inventions if they're created using KU resources or result from sponsored research. And we know that most of the research conducted on campus is sponsored either by the federal government, industry, a private foundation, or the institution itself. All of those, the results of all those work, if it's a patentable invention, they're owned by the university. And I like to remind people that the policy does require you to disclose your potential inventions to our office. That's the starting point where we get working. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes as well. But good chance to remind you, hey, we like to hear from you if you think you've developed something that's interesting. Couple other notes on IP ownership. If you've got undergraduates working with you, keep in mind that they are special in many, many ways. One of them is the way we manage their IP. In general, if it's an undergraduate student who's working on a sponsored project or using KU resources or is doing that work in collaboration with a faculty member, we will own the IP that they generate. Now, if it's done as part of coursework, if you have a student who's working on an experiential learning project, right? We see those sometimes in the engineering disciplines. I think we do see them sometimes in life sciences as well, right? Part of their course is, a question and coming up with a solution for that problem or something along those lines. If it's part of their coursework, we're not going to own it. The individual undergraduate is going to own it themselves. That's how we sort of split educational component from research component when it comes to undergrads. I'd also like you to keep in mind that other sponsored research agreements often include terms and conditions that apply to IP. My office spends a lot of time working with our colleagues in research administration to help move some of those agreements along and negotiate those complicated IP terms. Again, if we're talking about federal sponsorship, it's relatively easy. There's a streamlined, consistent way of approaching that thanks to Bayh-Dole. If we're talking about non-federal sponsors, then those grants and contracts can give ownership or licenses to the sponsor. They can require revenue sharing with the sponsor. Couple examples, if we're talking about an industry-sponsored clinical trial where the industry partner is giving us the protocol and providing the drug and paying for the research activities, then it's likely that we're going to give them ownership. If it's basic and applied research, we're much less likely to grant ownership. If we've helped develop the protocol, we're also much less likely to help give ownership to resulting IP. In all of that, keep in mind, however, that we also, as the university, will generally not agree to anything that will restrict your ability to publish the results or use those results to drive your research activity forward. that is sort of a bright line for us when we negotiate IP terms in a contract. We're not going to get in the way of our faculty's ability to continue their scholarship and research. Another thing to keep in mind, these terms, they show up not just in sponsored research contracts, you'll find them in MTAs, data use agreements, all of those sort of things. So just something to keep in mind as you go forward and we collaborate with others, be it in industry or other universities. IP is important, requires a little bit of thought on the front end when we're designing the project or getting the contract going, better than thinking about it on the back end when we've agreed to something that doesn't fit whatever our intent was. All right, so that's all the stuff around, again, research and IP at the very front end of the research activity. Now let's say we've got that interesting question, we got the grant, and now we've had our eureka or our aha moment, and we've made a really interesting discovery. What happens, right? As I mentioned earlier, I would encourage you to disclose that idea to your tech transfer office. Right? That's our job. And the only way we're going to find out about it, or the best way we're going to find out about it, is from our faculty. It's one of the things we are very focused on here as we try to revitalize KU-CTC, is that relationship with our faculty, that engagement, and the ability of you to come to us with questions when you think you have something that might be of value. So we're going to ask you to fill out a form. I know everyone loves forms. We are working to streamline ours here at KU. That form is going to ask our faculty a couple key questions about whatever they've invented. It's going to ask, hey, can you give us a description of your invention? We need to understand it. Can you give us a little bit of data showing that it works the way you might intend it or expect it to work? We're going to ask who was involved. It's good to know whether it was you and colleagues at another institution, you and colleagues here at KU, you and your students. We need to know who was involved. To the prior slide, we need to know what support was used. Was it a grant from the federal government? Was it a contract from somebody else? All of those terms are important to understand. And lastly, but most importantly, we need to understand your publication and presentation plans. And that leads to one of the most common questions, which is, what is the biggest risk or the biggest problem that is created or to be concerned about when you, and that can compromise your ability to protect your invention, right? The biggest thing we worry about is a public disclosure prior to our patent application being filed, right? The patent office takes this viewpoint that says, if you've published something or you've put it into the public domain in any way before you file your patent application, you've donated it to the public. There are no proprietary rights for your invention. You gave it away. You gave it to the public. It's in the public domain. So it's just something very important to keep in mind. It includes not just academic publications, but includes presentations at conferences too. If those conferences are open to individuals outside of your home institution. So for KU, if those are open to people outside of KU, that's considered a public disclosure. It's something to keep in mind. One of the things that sort of drives us batty in our business with journals are journals that do two things. One are the preprint servers, where things go up early and are disseminated early before we have a chance, right, to file a patent application. The second thing are the journals that publish the proofs upon acceptance, right? The American Chemical Society is great at doing that, right? They'll put something up as soon as it's accepted. That creates a really difficult date for us to maneuver around if we're going to file a patent application. Keep in mind, they take a very broad scope of what is considered public. Again, anything, even if it's, my own dissertation, which is sitting on a shelf collecting dust, if somebody could go and access it, even if they don't, or nobody has ever taken it out, just because it is accessible to the public means it's in the public domain. Now, in the US, we do have some additional levers we can pull to file a patent application, but outside the US, it's really, really challenging. And that's particularly important to keep in mind if you are in the life sciences, because if we're dealing with biologics or drug development or medical devices, much of the market in the world is outside the US. Those rights are important to our corporate partners. And so if we don't have patent rights somewhere like Europe, we may not be able to hook a partner to do the rest of the development work. All right, so now you've disclosed your new invention. It's come in the door. What is my office going to do? This is where we spend a lot of our time, is in this sort of evaluate and protect step. We're going to take that disclosure and we're going to look at it and make sort of an investment decision, right? Patents are expensive. Are we going to invest in filing a patent or not? What are the kind of things that we take into consideration when we do that? We look at three primary things. We look at the technology itself. We're going to take the description that you've sent to us, do a little bit of our own research, and then we're going to try to surmise what the product might be that comes out in the end. What is a problem that it is solving? What what problem is being solved by that product? And ultimately, does the data sort of support what we think that product is, or how we think it would work. We're certainly not going to do that to the same extent that your reviewers at a journal or somebody reviewing a grant will, but we're going to take a look at it and say, hey, if I looked at that image, would it lead me to make the assumption or make the decision that it works the way it's intended? So that's one piece of our evaluation. The second piece is to look at the market. Now, when I say market, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking at patient population, addressable patient population. We're looking at where those patients are. We're looking at what are the features and the benefits of our technology in comparison to current solutions, trying to benchmark how it's currently addressed versus what the improvements might be with our particular invention. And then we're going to look at the competitors in the market. What drugs are already available, what devices are already out on the market, what is coming to the market, what's currently in the clinic. I'm going to look at all of those things to get a sense of where we might place our innovation in the scope of everything else that's already available. And the last piece is we're going to look at IP. So we're going to take a look at existing academic references and existing patent references and look and say, okay, are there a lot of references out there that are similar to what we think we've invented, or are we really free and clear? We're going to use that and try to get a sense of, okay, how gray? Is it dark gray? Is it really light gray? How much room is there to move? Pull those three things together, come up with a recommendation, file a patent, not file a patent, wait, perhaps there's data to come in an animal model that would be helpful. Wait on that. We're going to put all that together. We're going to make a recommendation. We're going to provide that to our faculty member. We're also probably going to ask a lot of additional questions as we try to understand the technology a little bit more. So I think this is also a good part to talk about what do we mean by IP, right? We've mentioned patents a number of times, but are patents the only type of IP that are of interest or the only way to protect your innovation? So the answer is no. Lots of different ways to look at different types of things and different ways to protect IP based on what type of innovation you've created. Utility patents is usually what we think about, right? Those are the things that protect inventions, processes, machines, devices, compounds, compositions, all of those sort of things. Basically, anything that's made by man is protectable by a patent, with the small exceptions of like a perpetual motion machine and a machine to raise people from the dead. Those are the examples I always hear, right? So that's what we use patents to protect: compositions of matter, things of manufacture, machines, devices. Interesting thing to keep in mind about patents: they don't give you a right to use your invention. They actually just give you a right to stop others from using it. So just because you have a patent doesn't mean you are empowered to use your own invention. You're more empowered to stop others from replicating what you've done. Second main bucket of IP that we see are copyrights. Copyrights protect original works of authorship, writings, photographs, songs, all of those sort of things. Keep in mind that they protect the form of expression, so the words on the page and the arrangement of the words on the page, the image, whatever that might be, not the idea that is being expressed, right? So not what's actually being described, just the way it's described. If you are an innovator working in the digital space, software code is protected by copyrights, and oftentimes that is what we rely on to protect that type of IP, is the copyright to the code. Databases also can be subject to copyrights in certain cases, so keep that in mind as well. Third main bucket are trademarks. Those provide protection for a name, a word, a symbol, something along those lines. Purpose really is to help differentiate products and services from one another. We don't do many trademarks, mostly because if we license to a company, The company is going to develop its own name for its own product, not whatever we gave it to here at the university. However, if you are somebody who is creating surveys, instruments, those types of interventions, sometimes we will pursue a trademark. And so don't be afraid to reach out to us with questions if you're in that space as an innovator. There are lots of other ways of protecting IP, trade secrets, plant patents, design patents, data rights, all of those sort of things. We just don't traffic in them very frequently. Mostly it's patents, copyrights, and trademarks. So now we've gone and we said, yes, this is great. We're going to invest money. We're going to file a patent application for this invention that you've created. What do we do next? Again, this is sort of the third or the second of three main places where KUCTC plays a role. We're going to try to partner that invention with somebody else, right? So we're going to try to identify a company to partner with. Maybe our invention fits in an existing product line that they have. We're going to spend a lot of time doing that. We do that in a couple different ways. We write sort of short marketing pieces that go on the website and are distributed to companies through the web. We do that through proactive marketing, actually taking and proactively contacting companies that we think might be of interest. For example, some of those companies that we may have thought were competitors early on may also make great licensees. And the last thing we do is we go to these one-on-one partnering meetings at conferences. These are big meetings where we go and we do sort of speed dating one-on-one with industry representatives to understand what their needs are and identify whether we have inventions that might fit that company's needs. The other side of that coin, if we can't find somebody, is helping form somebody or helping form a company, a new company to help drive that forward. This is related to the very early on SBIR, STTR seminar that's coming up. That's funding for small companies to help get them off the ground and do the early development work. We work with our innovators and our partners in the innovation ecosystem here at KU to help form new companies that then take the invention and help drive it forward. A lot of times, right, we may think that Merck or Pfizer, right, that's the end point. They're the great company to partner with, but what we have from the bench may be too early to get there. So we form a new company to do some of the additional development, maybe get it to IND, maybe get it into phase 1, and then get acquired by Merck. And so we do a lot of that work and support those efforts as well. I think it's also just in the global place or a place to globally mention sort of what to keep in mind as industry and academia continue to sort of move and work together. Right? I think the start of any good relationship, whether it's a license or sponsored research or just a collaboration with industry, is to understand that we're coming from different places, but together we can work and come up with some really interesting research, interesting solutions, answer interesting questions. But the fundamental starting point is to understand that we're different, right? And so how are we different? I think if we look at the university side of things, right, we know what we value. We value generating and disseminating new knowledge, making discoveries. We value academic freedom, open discourse. We are focused on teaching and research and service and a little bit of economic development, particularly at a public institution where we are supported by the state. Okay, that's us. We get that. Now, if we look on the other side and we talk about industry, what is industry interested in? Industry is interested in managing knowledge for profit, right? They want to control information until they can make the most money from it. That's one of their drivers. They're interested in keeping things confidential, keep it behind the curtain until the right time. They don't have that publish pressure that we have in academia. And so they limit public disclosure. They're focused on products, on profits, and really on research and development in the scope of creating new products and generating profits. I think it's really important, again, to understand that that's where they're starting from. And so when we come to work together to do something collaborative, to do something use-inspired, or do some applied or translational research, we have to understand that they're going to be interested on preserving those sort of key attributes. We're going to be focused on preserving our ability to disseminate and generate knowledge and continue to be part of academic discourse. And until we understand one another, we can't really work together. And so that's sort of the starting point I like to have in mind. It works when we talk about licensing IP to companies. I think it's also relevant to when you as a researcher may be working with an industry partner. Put yourself in their shoes, understand a little bit about what their drivers are going to be, because that'll probably help get us to a common ground quicker than if we just sort of stand in our corners and argue with one another. So, all right, so now we formed a new company. We're going to license our rights. What does it mean to license IP? This is sort of the third piece of the process for KUCTC. This is the negotiation of the grand contract with the company that gives them exclusive access or exclusive rights to our invention to develop a product, right? And so when we negotiate those contracts, they're big. What do they look like, right? Well, you may think that the primary goal is revenue generation, but often it's not. The primary goal for us when we negotiate a license to university IP is to make that technology available to the public in the quickest manner possible, right? So we are very much focused on our licensees being diligent in developing a product from the IP, and we're going to have verifiable milestones in our contract with them. We're going to say, you said it would take you 5 years to get to IND. 5 years later, where's your IND? We're going to have those kind of benchmarked throughout our agreement. We're also going to expect a fair commercial return for what we've invested and contributed, but the timing and the form of that can be tailored, right? It doesn't have to all be upfront. It can be delayed gratification. It can be sprinkled along time. Lots of different ways to skin that cat. We're going to expect our licensee to pay the costs associated with patenting and bear the risks of doing business, right? So they're going to have to carry insurance. If we get sued because the drug that we discovered here has harmed someone, we're going to expect them to cover our butts and indemnify us. We're going to expect them to go out and enforce the IP rights against competitors. Again, really important and different about working with a university than working in a business to business or a company to company arrangement. We are very, very, very clearly going to limit the potential interference with any ongoing research that's occurring at the university, right? So again, in our licenses, just like sponsored research agreements, we're going to preserve your right to publish and preserve your right to practice and use the inventions you've created for research purposes. So that's a little bit about what we care about in a license. Now, we've licensed our IP, it's out of our hands, it's into the company's hands. The company then, and this is why I say this could be a whole pipeline to itself, is going to go through all of the steps to continue to develop and refine that product and fund the development of that product and move it toward the market, ultimately to sales. Let's say that all goes well. We've got a product on the market that is covered by KUIP, being sold, and now is generating some revenue. And that revenue is coming back to the university. What happens to that revenue when it comes back to the university? It's a very common question from our faculty. How do the dollars get split? It follows our IP policy and our tech transfer policy. For KU, this is what it looks like. You, as an inventor, are going to receive a third of whatever the university receives as personal income. A third goes back to the inventors. 1/3 of the revenue that comes to KU is going to stay with either the Center for Research, if we're talking Lawrence, or with the RI, if we're talking at the medical center. The other third is going to go to your department or center. From that third, 2/3 are retained in the department. The other 1/3, which really, if you do the math, works out to 10%, that 10% is going to go to a discretionary research account for the inventors themselves. I personally find that to be one of the most important things about the way revenue is distributed. That 10% goes into a discretionary account for our researchers to help them serve as sort of the seed money to do additional research, to run that experiment that maybe I couldn't get federally funded, but is really, really interesting, that might turn up the next great invention. I love the way the money sort of works back through the system. And what the, again, sort of genius in my mind for the way revenue is handled is that it keeps us all aligned. The university, the department, the inventor, the lab, everybody is focused on the same goal, watching the product and helping the product move toward the market. Now, If you are an entrepreneurial type faculty member and you happen to found a company and you own that company, your equity holdings as the founder of the company that has licensed the KU IP doesn't diminish your ability to share in revenue. The way our revenue policy works is even if you own a big chunk of the company that's licensed the IP, you would still get to participate in any royalties that are generated that come back to KU under a license. That's not true at every institution. That's something that I think you would need to look into if you're not at KU and you're at one of our partner institutions in the CTSA. So I'll just wrap up this section real quickly by talking a little bit about how we define success. So how do you define success when it comes to innovation and commercialization? Is it the number of patents? Is it the number of licenses? Is it the number of companies? Is it the dollars? Is it the jobs? Is it the products? You'll hear from leadership at institutions, all of these things, right? Well, this is important, that's important. At the end of the day, to me, and this is sort of the parting message from this part, is success is impact. And so it's all of the above. This is a very long timeline. This is a long pipeline, lots of different steps along the way. And so keep in mind that any of these individual things can be a mark of success at a particular part in the pipeline, but it's all of them in aggregate that really tell the story of how the innovations at the university have impact. So please take that home with you for the rest of the day. Now I'll switch gears one last time and talk a little bit about tech transfer at KU. So we are the KU Center for Technology Commercialization. We are a one university office that's serving researchers at all 5 of our campuses, and we aspire to add value to the university and to our research enterprise by doing a couple things. You've heard about them already: identifying new IP resulting from research, negotiating licenses for that intellectual property, and then collaborating with our partners in the innovation ecosystem and the industry engagement ecosystems on our campus to help build bridges either to partners in innovation or partners in industry. We, however, are a relatively small office. At the time I put this slide together, it was 7, we're down to 6. We have 4 open searches, and we are focused on licensing, IP management, and then sort of back office operations. We do have scientists and lawyers as part of our team, as you might expect, because we do operate in business, law, and technology. It takes a little bit of all of those skill sets. We try to diversify and have a little bit of all of that in our team. We report through David Franikar, who's the CFO at the Med Center, but in reality, we report to a board, and that board is made up equally of folks and senior leadership from KU Lawrence and from KUMC. Now, this piece, I think, applies regardless of whether you're at KU or not. When should you contact your tech transfer office, your innovation office, your patent office, whatever it might be? I would like to think you pick up the phone and you call us, you send us that email when you've made that discovery or invention that you think could have a usefulness outside of the university. If that definition doesn't work for you, then maybe this does, which is if you've come up with a creative solution for a challenge or a problem that's been in your field or in your part of your industry for years, and you've got that thing that you think solves it, please pick up the phone, let us know. And maybe most importantly, do that before you publish or present your potential invention or your discovery, because that's when we really start facing some challenges if you've done that, if you've published before we get our hands on it. Lastly, why should you contact us? I like to think of us as good navigators, good concierges, good partners and collaborators. We are a starting point. We like to think that we provide guidance to our researchers about IP protection, commercialization, and help make connections to other parts of the innovation ecosystem and resources at KU. We understand that our innovation ecosystem here is, a bit spread out across all of our campuses, different resources and places. We can be a good starting point, help get you where you need to go. Lastly, I've talked a lot about our main roles, but I'm going to talk a little bit too about what else we do. That's the bottom half of this slide. We obviously educate our researchers about IP, tech transfer, and entrepreneurship. we market IP, we support the development of startup companies based on KU intellectual property. Importantly, we monitor our licensees for compliance, right? They say they're going to get to a certain point. We're going to check in with them periodically. We're going to try to make sure that they pay us on time, all of those sort of very fun things. We ensure federal compliance and research sponsor guideline compliance. And again, lastly, we're part of a team. We're part of the KU innovation ecosystem, and we work across silos with folks in Lawrence and here at the Med Center. Lastly, I want to, just recognize again that we have folks in the audience who are not part of KU, and so I don't want to leave you out. So I did my best here to try to, identify where you should go at your home institution if you've come up with a great next invention or you have a great idea, right? At most universities and AMCs, there's going to be a tech transfer office or something similar. In a pinch, my recommendation is if you can't identify who to go to, then start either with your legal office. General counsel is usually pretty easy to find, or your research administration office. They might be able to guide you. And at many universities, the tech transfer office is part of the research administration infrastructure, so you can start there. I've also listed off here the specific innovation or tech transfer websites for folks at KU, at Children's Mercy, at K-State, at UMKC. And then if you were part of KCU or part of St. Luke's, I've included the links for your research administration websites, because to me, that was the best place I could find to start. Again, if you have an invention or you think you've created something, that would be where I would go. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up and just say thank you to everybody for listening for the last hour or so. And I'm open to any questions.
Yes.
Dr. Michaels, thank you so much for that presentation. Just wanted to let everyone know that there's a lot of links here in the chat to the resources that Dr. Michaels laid out, and his talk and slides will be made available on our website. So a couple quick questions. Dr. Simpkins, you?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. One, does the writing about a possible patent in a NIH application or some other funding application constitute publication?
Excellent question. No, in general, if you have your invention as part of a grant application, it is considered the grant submission and grant review process at NIH or NSF is not a public process, and so it is not considered a public disclosure. The only time it becomes public is if somebody, files a Freedom of Information Act request to get it from the grantor, and in that case, we usually receive a notification and we can redact certain information that's related to proprietary technology. So no, don't consider your grant application a public disclosure.
That's very helpful. Thank you. The other thing is sometimes universities only want to do an application for the United States and not markets. They don't want to make patent applications for China, for Europe, and it's expensive.
It is.
And and it doesn't. If you're an industrial partner, it doesn't make any sense, because the industrial partner is going to patent in all those places. The university just wants to patent in the U.S. That makes no sense. You don't have a meeting, and you don't share. You don't really have an equal sharing of the expense of patenting, which is the way it should be if you're going to be a partner.
Right. I mean, just to comment on that a minute is, one of the things that we are working for KU specifically is to help, again, sort of identify the key markets where we do need protection earlier on so that they can be part of the dialogue and part of the conversation and part of the planning. Another just, very honest, sort of fact of life for a tech transfer office is that we don't have unlimited budgets. And so we are often trying to make the best, most educated investments that we can. And that's why I say it's an investment thesis, it's a philosophy, it's how we choose what we invest in, and it's multimodal in terms of the information we need to look at and pull in to make those decisions. Right. I mean, and part of that is, again, we have limited budgets, and so we have to pick and choose because we can't support everything everywhere all the time. And that is just a very challenging fact of life for folks in my role, in my position.
It's tough. Thank you very much.
Thank you for understanding.
Yes.
Great questions, great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here with us. Be sure to mark on your calendars our next Research and Discovery Grand Rounds on October 26th. If you need to reach out to Dr. Michaels, we've got all the links here in the chat. We'll hold it open for just another minute if you need to pull anything out of there. Thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it.
And yes, please, if you have a question and we didn't have time to answer it, feel free to just ping me in an email, and we will try to get it answered for you.
Thanks so much, Cliff. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
I appreciate the invite.